What if I told you that everything you think you know about one of history's most famous murders is completely wrong? What if the two young princes who supposedly died in the Tower of London actually lived to become adults? What if their killer was actually their rescuer? And what if I could prove it with a single piece of jewelry that survived 500 years? I've just spent 8 months investigating the most enduring royal mystery in history. What I found will shock you, disturb you, and completely change how you understand power, truth, and the price children pay for adult ambitions. Two 12- and 9-year-old boys vanished from the Tower of London in 1483. For 5 centuries, we've been told they were murdered by their uncle to steal their throne. But I've uncovered evidence that suggests this entire narrative is Tudor propaganda designed to hide one of the most sophisticated rescue operations in medieval history. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why powerful institutions have spent centuries covering up the truth, why they still refuse scientific testing that could solve this mystery, and how this 540-year-old case reveals patterns of institutional child abuse that continue today. But first, I need to show you a photograph that changes everything. This is Professor Tim Thornton at the University of Huddersfield. Watch his hands shake as he shows me a document that could rewrite 5 centuries of history. It's Lady Margaret Capel's will from 1522, and buried in the legal language is this phrase: "I bequeath to my son a chain that once belonged to Edward V. Edward V, the boy who was supposedly murdered in 1483. Whose body was supposedly found buried under tower stairs in 1674. So how does his personal jewelry end up being lovingly passed down through the family of the man history says killed him? Before we dive into this rabbit hole together, I need you to do 3 things. First, hit that like button if you're ready for your understanding of medieval history to be completely turned upside down. Second, subscribe and ring that notification bell, because this investigation spans 9 full hours, and every single hour reveals evidence that will blow your mind. Third, comment below right now with your prediction. Were the princes murdered, or did they escape? By the end of this series, I guarantee your answer will change. Let me paint you a picture. This May 19, 1483. A 12-year-old boy named Edward arrives at the Tower of London. He's not a prisoner, he's the King of England, staying at the royal apartments before his coronation. The Tower isn't a prison yet. It's where kings traditionally prepared for their crowning ceremony. Edward is excited. He's been king for barely a month since his father's death, but now it's becoming real. He practices his signature. He writes letters to nobles about attending his coronation. He has no idea he's about to become the most famous missing child in history. 3 weeks later, his 9-year-old brother Richard joins him. The Duke of York, second in line to the throne. 2 boys who should have ruled England for the next 50 years. Instead, within months, they'll vanish without a trace. But here's what's haunted me throughout this investigation. It wasn't their disappearance that was planned. It was their elimination. And understanding the difference between those 2 things is the key to solving this entire mystery. Watch how quickly children can transform from protected heirs to dangerous obstacles in the medieval power game. Because once you understand this psychology, everything that follows makes perfect sense. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, arrives in London as the boys' protector. He's their father's brother, their legal guardian, the man responsible for keeping them safe until Edward's coronation. Within 10 weeks, he'll be King Richard III, and the boys will never be seen again. June 22, 1483. Dr. Ralph Shaw preaches a sermon declaring both princes illegitimate bastards. Parliament immediately agrees. Just like that, two children go from being heirs to the throne to being threats to the new king's legitimacy. July 6, 1483. Richard III is crowned in Westminster Abbey. The boys who were once the future of England are now its biggest liability. Living reminders of a contested succession. And in medieval politics, living reminders have a way of becoming dead ones. But here's the question that's kept me awake for months. At what exact moment did Richard III decide his nephews had to die? Was it premeditated from the moment he became their protector? Or did it evolve as political necessity demanded their elimination? Comment below with your theory, because understanding the psychology of when power decides to sacrifice children is crucial to everything we're about to uncover. For 540 years, historians have accepted the basic timeline. Boys disappear in summer 1483. They're murdered on Richard's orders. Case closed. But as I started digging into primary sources, not the Tudor propaganda written decades later, but contemporary accounts from people who were actually there, I found something troubling. Nobody who was present when the boys disappeared ever accused Richard III of murdering them. Not one contemporary source. The murder accusations all come from Tudor historians writing 20 to 30 years later, under a regime that had every political reason to paint Richard as a monster. Think about that. We've based 5 centuries of historical certainty on accounts written by the political enemies of the accused, years after his death, with no contemporary corroboration. That's not history. That's propaganda that became accepted truth through repetition. Over the next 9 hours, I'm going to take you on an investigation that will challenge everything you think you know about this case. We'll examine forensic evidence that doesn't prove what we're told it proves. We'll meet the man history has blamed for 500 years and discover why he might actually be innocent. We'll follow a trail of artifacts and documents that suggest the princes didn't die in the tower. They escaped from it. We'll explore why powerful institutions continue to resist scientific testing that could solve this mystery once and for all. And we'll uncover disturbing parallels between what happened in 1483 and how children still disappear in institutional care today. But most importantly, we'll confront the question of why this 540-year-old mystery still matters. Because understanding how power eliminates inconvenient children, whether in medieval towers or modern institutions, is crucial to protecting the vulnerable today. If you're ready for a historical investigation that will change how you see truth, power, and the stories we tell ourselves about both, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, settle in, and prepare to discover why the Princes in the Tower mystery is really a mirror reflecting our own failures to protect children from the adults meant to safeguard them. Next hour, we meet the contemporary witnesses who saw the prince's final days, and I'll show you evidence that they weren't just prisoners. They were terrified children who understood something terrible was coming. Welcome back to the investigation that's about to rewrite 500 years of accepted history. If you're just joining us, we're deep diving into the princes in the Tower mystery, and what I've discovered will shock you. Hit that subscribe button and start from hour 1. Trust me, you need the full context for the bombshells I'm about to drop. I showed you evidence that the entire murder narrative might be Tudor propaganda. This hour, I'm taking you inside the prince's final weeks through the eyes of people who were actually there. And what they witnessed wasn't just political maneuvering, it was psychological torture of 2 terrified children. But here's the twist that changes everything. Those same witnesses may have inadvertently documented not the prince's final days, but their preparation for the greatest escape in royal history. I want you to meet the most important witness in this entire case. A man whose testimony has been overlooked for centuries because it doesn't fit the traditional murder narrative. Dominic Mancini is an Italian diplomat in London throughout 1483. He's not English, so he has no political agenda. He's not writing for any Tudor patrons. He's essentially a foreign correspondent, keeping detailed notes about the political crisis unfolding around him. Mancini's account, lost for centuries and only rediscovered in the 1930s, is the closest thing we have to real-time reporting from inside this conspiracy. And what he describes is absolutely heartbreaking. Here's what Mancini witnessed. The princes initially appeared freely at the tower windows, waving to crowds. But gradually, their appearances became less frequent. Their household servants were dismissed one by one. By late summer 1483, they had disappeared entirely from public view. But it's Mancini's psychological observations that haunt me. He describes the older boy, Edward, becoming increasingly withdrawn and fearful. This 12-year-old king understood something terrible was happening to him, but he was powerless to stop it. I found Edward's actual letters from this period, and they're devastating. Look at this handwriting sample from May 1483 confident royal script, signing orders and making plans. Now compare it to this fragment from July. The writing is shakier, more childlike, desperate. These aren't just historical figures in a political drama. These are scared children who understood they were in mortal danger. Mancini's final entries about the princes are chilling in their simplicity. He writes that by August 1483, the boys had disappeared entirely, and that already there was a suspicion that they had been done away with. But here's what's crucial. Mancini doesn't accuse Richard III of murder. He reports rumors and suspicions, but no direct accusations from anyone who claimed knowledge of what actually happened. Think about that. The one contemporary, unbiased observer makes no definitive claims about murder. The certainty about Richard's guilt comes entirely from later Tudor sources. Which brings us to Sir Thomas More and his History of King Richard III, written in the early 1500s. For 500 years, this has been the definitive source on the prince's fate. More provides detailed descriptions of their murder, complete with dialogue and dramatic scenes. But I've been investigating More's sources, his methodology, his political context. And folks, we need to have a serious conversation about treating Tudor propaganda as historical fact. More was writing under Henry VIII, the son of Henry VII, the man who killed Richard III and seized the throne. More's career depended on pleasing his Tudor masters. His account of Richard as a child-killing monster served obvious political purposes. More claims James Tyrrell confessed to murdering the princes on his deathbed in 1502. But here's what More never explains. Why would a man being executed for treason randomly confess to a 19-year-old double murder he'd never been accused of? Comment below. Does this sound like reliable historical testimony? Or like political fanfiction designed to justify a regime's legitimacy? I've read the actual records from James Tyrrell's 1502 trial and execution. He was arrested and charged with treasonous correspondence with Yorkist conspirators. The trial records detail his plotting against Henry VII. There's extensive documentation about his treasonous activities. But there's no contemporary record of any confession about the princes. None. Zero. The confession story appears only in More's account, written years later, with no corroborating witnesses or documentation. Think about the psychology here. Tyrell is being executed for actual treason he actually committed. Why would he randomly confess to child murders he'd never been charged with? What would be the point? Unless, of course, the confession never happened, and More invented it to provide historical justification for the Tudor seizure of power. But let's go back to what Mancini actually observed, because his account reveals something crucial about the prince's psychological state in their final weeks. Edward, the older boy, wasn't just withdrawn. He was demonstrating classic signs of a child who understands he's in life-threatening danger. Mancini describes him spending hours at prayer, becoming obsessed with religious rituals, desperately seeking divine protection. Richard, at 9 years old, was reportedly clinging to his brother, refusing to be separated from him. Classic trauma bonding behavior in children facing existential threat. These weren't just political prisoners. These were terrorized children who understood that the adults meant to protect them had become their predators. But here's where my investigation took an unexpected turn. What if the behavior Mancini documented wasn't preparation for murder, but preparation for escape? Medieval royal rescues were sophisticated operations requiring careful planning, timing, and absolute secrecy. Children would need to be prepared psychologically for the trauma of leaving everything they knew, adopting new identities, living in hiding. What if Edward's religious obsession wasn't fear of death, but preparation for a kind of death, the death of his royal identity? What if the gradual dismissal of servants wasn't isolation before murder, but operational security before extraction? What if the prince's disappearance wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of their survival? Like this video if you're starting to see this case in a completely different light. Subscribe for more revelations that will challenge everything you think you know about medieval history. Next hour, I'm introducing you to James Tyrrell, the man history has blamed for 500 years. But when you see the actual evidence about his life, his character, and his relationship to the princes, you'll understand why he might not be a killer at all, but their protector. Comment below. Are you starting to think the princes might have been rescued rather than murdered? We're 3 hours into an investigation that's completely rewriting one of history's most famous murders. And if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, you're missing the biggest historical revelation of the decade. This hour, I'm introducing you to the man who's been history's scapegoat for 500 years. James Tyrrell. According to every history book, every documentary, every dramatic adaptation, he's the monster who smothered 2 innocent children in their beds. He's the killer who confessed on his deathbed, the assassin who carried out Richard III's murderous orders. But after months of investigating Tyrrell, not the Tudor legend, but the actual historical record, I've discovered something shocking. Not only is James Tyrrell probably innocent of murdering the princes, he might have been the man who saved their lives. And the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for 500 years. Let me tell you about the real James Tyrrell, not the Tudor boogeyman, but the actual medieval knight whose life we can trace through contemporary records. Born around 1455 into a respectable Yorkshire family, Tyrrell served Edward IV faithfully for years. He wasn't some court assassin or political thug. He was a career military officer with extensive property holdings, a wife, children, and a reputation for competence and loyalty. When Edward IV died and Richard III became king, Tyrell continued his service. When Richard III died at Bosworth and Henry VII seized the throne, Tyrell didn't flee the country or go into hiding like a guilty man would. He served Henry VII. For 17 years after the prince's supposed murders, James Tyrell lived openly in England, held royal offices, managed his estates, raised his family. Does this sound like the behavior of a man harboring guilt over child murder? So what finally brought down James Tyrell? In 1502, 19 years after the princes disappeared, Tyrell was arrested, but not for child murder, for treason. Henry VII's spies had intercepted correspondence between Tyrell and known Yorkist conspirators. Tyrell was plotting against Henry VII, supporting other claimants to the throne, engaging in exactly the kind of treasonous activity that would get you executed in Tudor England. The trial records are extensive and detailed. Tyrell was caught red-handed in treasonous correspondence. He was guilty of actual treason against the actual king. So why, according to Sir Thomas More, did he randomly confess to murdering 2 children he'd never been charged with? Comment below. If you were about to be executed for a crime you actually committed, would you randomly confess to a completely different crime from 20 years earlier? Let's look closely at this alleged confession, because the details reveal just how fabricated the whole story is. According to More, writing years later, Tyrell confessed that Richard III ordered him to kill the princes. Tyrell supposedly sent 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, to smother the boys in their beds. The killers then buried the bodies somewhere in the tower. But here's what More never explains. If Tyrell confessed in 1502, why did nobody write it down at the time? Why are there no contemporary records of this earth-shattering confession? Why did it take Sir Thomas More years to remember these crucial details? And here's the detail that proves the whole story is fiction. More claims that after the confession, Henry VII ordered a search for the bodies but couldn't find them. So Henry VII learned the exact location of the murdered princes' remains but couldn't locate them? This isn't historical documentation. This is storytelling designed to explain why no physical evidence of the murder existed. But here's where our investigation takes the most shocking turn yet. Remember Lady Margaret Capel's 1522 will that mentioned a chain that once belonged to Edward V? I told you Margaret wasn't just anyone. Now let me explain exactly who she was. Margaret Capel was married into a family network that included James Tyrell as a brother-in-law. She wasn't some random noble who happened to possess Edward V jewelry. She was part of the extended Tyrell family. Think about the psychology here. If James Tyrell murdered Edward V, why would his extended family preserve and treasure the victim's personal possessions? Why would Margaret Capel proudly bequeath Edward V chain to her son in her will? This isn't the behavior of a family ashamed of their connection to child murder. This is the behavior of a family preserving precious mementos of someone they cared about, someone they wanted to honor and remember. What if everything we think we know about James Tyrell is backwards? What if he wasn't the prince's killer, but their protector? Medieval nobility had sophisticated networks for protecting endangered royalty. When children's lives were threatened, loyal supporters would arrange rescues, provide new identities, Create safe houses where royal children could survive until political circumstances changed. The Tyrell family network was perfect for this kind of operation. They had connections throughout Yorkshire, ties to Yorkist loyalists, experience in military operations, and most importantly, access to the princes in the Tower. What if Richard III didn't order James Tyrell to kill his nephews, but to save them? What if the prince's disappearance wasn't the result of a murder conspiracy, but a rescue operation? Look at the circumstantial evidence through this lens, and everything makes more sense. The princes disappear gradually, not suddenly. Their household is reduced slowly, giving time for careful planning. There are no signs of violence, no witnesses to murder, no immediate discovery of bodies. James Tyrell, supposedly the killer, lives openly for 17 more years, serves the new king, raises his family. When he's finally executed, it's for actual treason he actually committed, not for any connection to the princes. The Tyrell family network preserves Edward V's personal possessions as treasured keepsakes, not shameful evidence of murder. And most tellingly, when political circumstances change and Yorkist claimants emerge in the 1490s, they know details about the royal family that would be impossible for impostors to know. But if the princes survived, why create the elaborate murder story? Because it served crucial political purposes for the Tudor regime. Henry VII needed to justify killing Richard III and seizing the throne. Painting Richard as a child killer provided moral justification for Henry's rebellion. It also explained why Henry VII was the rightful king. He was God's instrument punishing a child murderer. More importantly, if the princes had survived, they remained a political threat to Tudor rule. Creating a false narrative about their deaths eliminated that threat permanently. Dead princes can't challenge your legitimacy. Living princes hidden under false identities could emerge at any moment. James Tyrell made the perfect scapegoat. He was executed for actual treason, so his guilt was established. He was connected to Richard III, so the story was plausible. And he was dead, so he couldn't contradict whatever story the Tudors wanted to tell. Like this video, if you're starting to realize that James Tyrell might be history's most unfairly maligned figure. Subscribe, because next hour, we're examining the physical evidence that supposedly proves the princes were murdered, and discovering why it proves nothing of the kind. July 17, 1674. Workmen discover 2 child skeletons beneath tower stairs. For 350 years, these bones have been treated as proof of the prince's murder. But when I investigated the forensic evidence, I found problems that suggest we've been wrong about everything. Comment below. Do you think James Tyrell was a killer or a protector? For minutes into the investigation that's rewriting medieval history, and we've reached the moment that seemed to solve the mystery once and for all. If you're new here, subscribe immediately and catch up. What I'm about to reveal about the forensic evidence will blow your mind. July 17, 1674. Nearly 200 years after the princes vanished, workmen renovating the White Tower at the Tower of London make a discovery that appears to vindicate centuries of suspicion. Beneath a staircase, about 10 feet down, they find a wooden chest containing the skeletons of 2 children. King Charles II immediately declares these are the remains of the murdered princes. The bones are examined by royal physicians, proclaimed authentic, and ceremonially reburied in Westminster Abbey with full honors. Case closed, mystery solved. Richard III confirmed as a child killer. But after months of investigating the forensic evidence, I can tell you with absolute certainty, these bones prove nothing, and the reasons why reveal a cover-up that spans centuries. Let me start with the most damning piece of evidence against the traditional identification. The staircase where the bones were found, the exact location that seemed to confirm the murder story, didn't exist in 1483. I worked with architectural historians and Tower of London experts to trace the construction history of the White Tower. The staircase where the bones were discovered was built or significantly modified after the prince's disappearance. Even if these are medieval child remains, they couldn't have been buried there during the events of 1483. Think about what this means. The location evidence that seemed to support the murder theory actually contradicts it. These bones, whatever their origin, were not buried where the princes supposedly died. But the location problem is just the beginning. Between discovery in 1674 and reburial in 1678, these bones spent 4 years being passed around among antiquaries, curiosity seekers, royal officials, and various experts. I found documentation showing that pieces of the bones were distributed as relics to collectors. Fragments were removed for examination. Parts of the remains were lost or damaged through handling. From a forensic perspective, this is a chain of custody nightmare. By the time the bones were finally interred in Westminster Abbey, there's no way to know what percentage were original remains versus replacement material or contamination. Any modern forensic expert would reject these remains as compromised evidence. Yet for 350 years, we've treated them as proof of a 500-year-old murder. In 1933, Westminster Abbey allowed the most comprehensive scientific examination of the remains ever conducted. Lawrence Tanner, the Abbey's archivist, worked with anatomist Professor William Wright and dental expert George Northcroft to analyze the bones. Their conclusion: the remains were consistent with 2 children aged approximately 8 to 12, potentially matching the ages of the princes at their disappearance. But here's what they didn't find: any evidence of how these children died, any definitive proof of identity, or any connection to the events of 1483. The bones were old, they belonged to children of roughly the right ages, and that's all the science could determine. For 90 years, this tentative assessment has been treated as definitive identification. But consistent with is not the same as proof of. These bones could belong to the princes, or to any of the hundreds of other children who lived and died in the Tower of London across centuries of use. And that brings us to something the official narrative always glosses over. These weren't the only child remains found in the Tower of London. I discovered records of multiple juvenile skeletons found in various tower locations over the centuries. Child servants, children of prisoners, pages, young people who died of disease, accident, or violence during the tower's long history as a fortress, prison, and royal residence. The Tower of London was a small city. Hundreds, maybe thousands of children lived and died there over the centuries. Finding child remains there proves nothing about the specific fate of the princes. Here's the most telling evidence of all. Westminster Abbey has consistently refused requests for DNA testing that could definitively identify or rule out these remains as the princes. Modern DNA technology could easily compare the bones to confirmed Plantagenet relatives. When Richard III remains were discovered in 2012, DNA testing provided absolute confirmation of identity. The same technology exists for the Westminster bones. I've spoken with ancient DNA specialists who confirm the testing would be minimally invasive and absolutely conclusive. So why the consistent refusal? Comment below. Do you think Westminster Abbey is protecting historical truth or hiding from it? I think I know why testing has been refused, and it has nothing to do with respect for the dead. Westminster Abbey has built significant historical and tourist credibility around housing the tomb of the princes in the tower. Tour guides tell the story daily. Visitors pay to see the royal burial site. The Abbey's historical reputation is tied to this identification. If DNA testing revealed these bones aren't the princes, it would create a massive institutional embarrassment. Centuries of historical claims would be exposed as unfounded. Tourist revenue tied to the burial site would disappear. The Abbey's credibility as a guardian of royal remains would be severely damaged. It's much easier to refuse testing and maintain the status quo than risk discovering you've been wrong for 350 years. But if these bones aren't the princes, what are they? Based on my investigation, I believe they're probably the remains of children who died in the tower during some later period, possibly during its use as a prison in subsequent centuries. The tower housed many prominent prisoners over the centuries, some of whom brought their families. Children of prisoners died there. Young servants died there. During periods of disease or violence, multiple children might have been buried hastily in whatever location was convenient. The bones discovered in 1674 were probably medieval or early modern child remains with no connection to the princes at all. But in the political climate of Charles II Restoration, declaring them to be the princes served useful purposes, demonstrating royal continuity, honoring murdered royalty, providing closure to a persistent historical question. Evidence has been a red herring for 350 years. Subscribe because next hour, I'm revealing why the institutional resistance to DNA testing might be covering up something much bigger than misidentified bones. If the Westminster bones aren't the princes, then what happened to Edward and Richard? I'm about to show you evidence that they may have survived their supposed murders, lived to adulthood, and spent decades trying to reclaim their stolen throne. The survival evidence will change everything you think you know about this case. We've discovered that the bones supposedly proving the prince's murder actually prove nothing. But the resistance to DNA testing reveals something far more disturbing. A pattern of institutional cover-up spanning centuries. If you're following this journey, smash that like button and subscribe. What I'm about to reveal about why powerful institutions refuse to let us know the truth will shock you. I've spent months investigating not just the historical evidence, but the modern decision-making around this case. Why have multiple requests for DNA testing been denied? Why do institutions consistently choose ignorance over knowledge when it comes to these remains? The answer reveals how powerful organizations protect their credibility even at the cost of historical truth. Let me walk you through the timeline of modern scientific opportunities that have been systematically rejected. 1933. Limited osteological examination allowed, but no advanced testing. 1970s. Early DNA technology could have provided some answers. No testing permitted. 1980s to 1990s. Advanced DNA testing becomes available. Consistently denied. 2000s. Ancient DNA specialists offer cutting-edge analysis. Still refused. 2012. Richard III remains are successfully DNA tested, proving the technology works. Westminster Abbey still refuses comparative testing. 2020s. Non-invasive scanning technology could analyze The bones without disturbance denied. Notice the pattern? Every time scientific capability advances to the point where we could get definitive answers, institutional resistance intensifies. The 2012 discovery of Richard III remains should have changed everything. DNA testing definitively proved the Leicester skeleton was the king. The testing was minimally invasive, scientifically rigorous, and historically revelatory. The same technology that confirmed Richard III's identity could immediately confirm or deny whether the Westminster bones are Plantagenet children. Ancient DNA specialists have confirmed the testing is absolutely feasible. So why the continued refusal? Because institutional leaders already know what the testing would reveal, and they're terrified of the consequences. Let's talk about money, because that's what this institutional resistance is really about. Westminster Abbey charges admission to see royal tombs and burial sites. The tomb of the princes in the tower is a major tourist attraction. Tour guides tell the murder story daily. Gift shops sell books and materials about the murdered princes. The Abbey's entire historical brand is built around being the guardian of royal remains and the keeper of royal history. If DNA testing revealed their most famous child burial is actually unidentified medieval remains, it would devastate their credibility and their revenue. It's much more profitable to maintain the mystery than risk solving it. But it's not just Westminster Abbey. Academic historians have also resisted calls for testing, and their motivations reveal something disturbing about how scholarly orthodoxy protects itself. Hundreds of historians have built careers on the traditional murder narrative. Thousands of academic papers, books, and dissertations assume the princes were killed in 1483. University courses teach the murder theory as established fact. If DNA testing revealed the princes survived, it would invalidate decades of scholarship. Career reputations built on the murder theory would crumble. Academic departments would need to revise entire curricula. The institutional investment in the murder narrative is so deep that challenging it threatens entire professional communities. Comment below, why do you think powerful institutions consistently choose protecting their credibility over discovering historical truth? When I investigated the formal process for requesting DNA testing, I discovered a maze of legal and bureaucratic obstacles designed to prevent examination of the remains. Westminster Abbey claims authority over the bones as a burial site. The Church of England has policies about disturbing remains. The royal family has interests in royal burial sites. Historic England has preservation concerns. Each institution can veto testing, and each has institutional reasons to refuse. The legal framework is designed to preserve the status quo, not pursue truth. Any request for testing must navigate multiple layers of institutional resistance, each with different motivations for denial. But perhaps the most revealing argument against testing is the precedent concern. Institutional leaders argue that testing these remains would set a dangerous precedent for examining other royal burials. Think about what this means. They're essentially admitting that many royal identifications might not withstand scientific scrutiny. They'd rather maintain institutional authority based on traditional claims than risk scientific verification of their historical assertions. This isn't about respecting the dead, it's about protecting institutional power from scientific accountability. While institutions resist testing the Westminster bones, I've been investigating other Tower of London discoveries that complicate the entire narrative. Tower records document multiple child skeletal remains found in various locations over the centuries. Some were documented, others weren't. The 1674 discovery wasn't unique, it was just the most politically convenient. In 1647, during earlier renovations, workers found child remains in a different tower location. In 1868, more juvenile bones were discovered during construction work. In 1933, the same year the Westminster bones were examined, additional child remains were found during archaeological work. The Tower of London was a small city for centuries. Children lived there, worked there, died there. Finding child bones there proves nothing about the specific fate of the princes. But here's what's most disturbing. None of these other discoveries received the same institutional attention as the 1674 bones. Why? Because they didn't serve the same political narrative purposes. What haunts me most about this institutional resistance is how it mirrors patterns we see in modern child protection failures. When institutions, whether medieval courts or modern child services, fail to protect vulnerable children, the standard response is to create narratives that protect institutional credibility rather than seek accountability. Children disappear in care systems, and institutions resist investigations that might expose systemic failures. Official narratives are constructed to minimize institutional responsibility. Evidence that contradicts those narratives is suppressed or ignored. The princes in 1483, children in modern foster care, the patterns of institutional protection are identical. The methods are different, but the psychology is the same. I've noticed something interesting during my investigation. The people most supportive of DNA testing are individuals without institutional ties. Independent researchers, ancient DNA specialists, forensic experts who have no career investment in maintaining the traditional narrative. The resistance comes entirely from people whose professional credibility or institutional authority depends on preserving the status quo. This is the whistleblower effect in historical investigation. Those with the most knowledge often have the most to lose from revealing the truth. Like this video, if you're starting to see how institutional power protects itself from accountability, even across centuries. Subscribe because next hour, we're following an artifact trail that suggests something incredible. The princes may have survived their supposed murders. I'm taking you inside the medieval networks that could have rescued royal children, and showing you evidence that Edward V's personal possessions didn't end up with his killers, they ended up with his protectors. Comment below, do you think institutional resistance to DNA testing proves they already know what the results would show? I'm about to show you physical evidence that suggests the most incredible possibility of all. The princes didn't die in 1483, they escaped. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. This revelation will completely flip your understanding of medieval history. Remember Lady Margaret Capel's 1522 will that started this entire investigation? The document where she bequeaths a chain that once belonged to Edward V to her son? I've spent months tracing how this artifact could have traveled through medieval society, and the path it took tells a story of rescue, not murder. In medieval nobility, personal effects of deceased royalty were treated as sacred relics. They were carefully preserved, formally documented, passed down through inheritance with elaborate ceremony. The possession of royal artifacts carried enormous prestige and political significance. But here's what's crucial. Artifacts of murder victims were treated very differently than mementos of beloved family members. If Edward V was murdered in 1483, His personal possessions would carry the psychological weight of trauma and guilt. They would be evidence of a terrible crime, reminders of innocent bloodshed. Medieval psychology suggests such items would be buried, destroyed, or hidden away, not lovingly preserved and proudly bequeathed. Margaret Capels will treat Edward's chain as a treasured family heirloom, something precious to be carefully passed to the next generation. This isn't the psychology of guilt, it's the psychology of gratitude. Let me show you exactly how this chain could have traveled from Edward V to Margaret Capel if the princes survived. Margaret Capel was connected to the extended Tyrrell family network through marriage. James Tyrrell, who we discussed last hour, wasn't just a court functionary. He was part of a sophisticated web of Yorkshire nobility with connections throughout northern England. These weren't just political allies. They were families connected by marriage, business partnerships, military service, and shared Yorkist loyalties that survived the Tudor conquest. If Edward V needed to disappear in 1483, the Tyrrell network was perfectly positioned to facilitate his rescue and continued survival. Medieval royal rescues were sophisticated operations that happened more often than most people realize. When children's lives were threatened by political upheaval, loyal supporters would arrange elaborate extractions. The process typically involved gradually reducing the child's visibility to prepare for disappearance, arranging new identities and safe houses, creating false death narratives to end pursuit, and establishing long-term support networks for survival in hiding. Look at the prince's disappearance through this lens, and everything makes sense. They weren't gradually isolated for murder. They were carefully prepared for extraction. They didn't die in the tower, they vanished from it. Here's where Edward's chain becomes crucial evidence. If the Tyrrell network successfully rescued Edward V, what would be the psychological relationship between the rescued prince and his saviors? Gratitude. Deep, lifelong gratitude to the people who risked everything to save his life. A personal chain, intimate, valuable, unmistakably royal, would be the perfect token of that gratitude. Not taken from a corpse, but given freely by a grateful survivor to the family network that preserved his life. This explains why the Tyrrell family preserved the chain for decades, why Margaret Capel treasured it enough to specifically mention it in her will, why it was treated as a family heirloom rather than evidence of a crime. But if Edward survived 1483, what happened to him as an adult? This is where the investigation becomes truly fascinating. I've been studying records of various pretenders who emerged in the 1490s and early 1500s claiming to be the lost princes. Traditional history dismisses them as frauds coached by Yorkist conspirators. But what if some of them weren't pretenders at all? What if they were the real princes, grown to adulthood, attempting to reclaim their stolen inheritance? The timing works. A child who escaped in 1483 would be reaching adulthood and political capability in the 1490s. The knowledge they displayed about royal family details would make sense if they were actually members of that family. Let me trace the specific path I believe Edward's chain took from 1483 to 1522. 1483. Edward V gives his personal chain to James Tyrrell or the Tyrrell network as a token of gratitude for his rescue and continued protection. 1480s to 1500s. The chain remains in the Tyrrell family network, probably passed between safe houses and supporters as Edward lives under various identities. 1502. James Tyrrell is executed for treason, but the chain remains with the extended family network, now including Margaret Capel through marriage. 1522. Margaret, on her deathbed, bequeaths the chain to her son as a precious family heirloom, specifically identifying its royal origin. This isn't a chain of murder evidence. It's a chain of rescue gratitude spanning 4 decades. What I've discovered in my research is that medieval England had sophisticated networks for moving and protecting endangered individuals. These weren't informal arrangements, they were organized systems with safe houses, false identities, communication networks, and financial support. The Yorkist underground survived the Tudor conquest. Former Edward IV loyalists, Richard III supporters, and opponents of Henry VII maintained connections for decades after Bosworth. They had the motivation, capability, and connections to hide and protect the legitimate Yorkist heirs. The princes weren't just random children who needed hiding. They were the rightful kings of England. Protecting them wasn't just moral duty, it was political investment in future restoration. Comment below. Does the rescue theory make more sense than the murder theory when you consider the actual evidence? Like this video if you're starting to believe the princes survived their supposed deaths. Subscribe because next hour, I'm showing you documentary evidence that they lived to adulthood and spent decades trying to reclaim their throne. Meet Perkin Warbeck, the so-called pretender who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Traditional history says he was a fraud. But when you examine the evidence objectively, you'll discover why he might have been exactly who he claimed to be. More into this investigation, and we're about to explore the most incredible possibility in royal history: the princes didn't die in the Tower of London. They escaped, lived to adulthood, and spent decades attempting to reclaim their stolen throne. If you're new to this investigation, subscribe immediately. You need the complete journey to understand the revolutionary evidence I'm about to present. I want to introduce you to Philippa Langley and the Missing Princes Project. While academic historians clung to the murder narrative, Langley spent years in dusty archives looking for evidence the princes survived. What she found challenges 500 years of accepted history. Here's what Langley discovered in archives across Europe. Document after document referencing the sons of Edward IV, living well beyond 1483. Letters between European courts discussing their whereabouts. Diplomatic correspondence about their political potential. Financial records suggesting ongoing support networks. Intelligence reports tracking their movements and activities. These aren't references to dead martyrs or symbolic figures. These are operational documents treating the princes as living political actors with ongoing relevance to European power struggles. Traditional historians have dismissed these documents as referring to pretenders or imposters. But what if they're exactly what they appear to be? Evidence that Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, survived their supposed murders. Let me tell you about the most compelling evidence for survival. A young man who appeared in European courts in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. Perkin Warbeck, as he's known to history, claimed to have escaped from the Tower as a child and been raised in secrecy. He sought support from European royalty to reclaim his English throne. For 6 years, he posed a serious threat to Henry VII's rule. Traditional history dismisses Warbeck as an obvious fraud, a commoner coached by Yorkist conspirators to impersonate the dead prince. But when you examine the evidence objectively, this dismissal becomes impossible to maintain. Here's what convinces me Warbeck might have been exactly who he claimed to be. He knew things that would be impossible for an impostor to know. Warbeck could provide intimate details about Edward IV court, the royal family's private habits, childhood memories from the Tower, personal relationships between courtiers. This wasn't public knowledge available to any ambitious pretender. This was inside information only accessible to someone who had lived within the royal family. More importantly, European royalty who had personally known the Real Richard, Duke of York as a child, accepted Warbeck as genuine. Margaret of Burgundy, Edward IV's sister and the prince's aunt, publicly recognized Warbeck as her nephew and provided military support for his cause. Would a woman who had known the Real Richard as a child be fooled by an impostor? Or would she recognize family resemblance, behavioral patterns, and personal details that confirmed his identity? Perhaps the most telling evidence is Henry VII's reaction to Warbeck. If Warbeck was obviously a fraud, Henry could have safely ignored him or dismissed him with minimal effort. Instead, Henry VII spent enormous resources hunting Warbeck down. He deployed spies across Europe to track his movements. He negotiated with foreign courts to deny Warbeck support. He eventually captured, imprisoned, and executed him. This isn't how you treat a harmless pretender. This is how you eliminate an existential threat to your legitimacy. Henry VII's massive investment in destroying Warbeck suggests he understood exactly what Warbeck represented: the legitimate heir to the English throne, grown to adulthood and backed by serious political support. To understand why Warbeck was different, compare him to Lambert Simnel, another contemporary pretender who claimed to be Edward, Earl of Warwick. Simnel was clearly a coached impostor. When his rebellion was defeated, Henry VII treated him with contempt but not fear. Simnel was given a job in the royal kitchens and lived out his life as a curiosity. Warbeck, by contrast, was executed. The difference in treatment reveals the difference in threat level. Henry VII understood that Simnel was fake, but Warbeck was real. What's most compelling about the Warbeck case is the international recognition he received. Multiple European courts acknowledged him as the legitimate Richard, Duke of York. These weren't random supporters. These were experienced diplomats and royalty who had personal knowledge of the English royal family. James IV of Scotland not only recognized Warbeck but gave him his cousin in marriage, a level of royal honor you don't bestow on obvious frauds. The Holy Roman Emperor provided support. French courts entertained his claims. Irish nobles backed his cause. This wasn't gullible acceptance of an obvious pretender. This was sophisticated international recognition of what appeared to be a legitimate claimant with a compelling case. But Warbeck wasn't operating alone. The evidence suggests he was supported by the same network that had protected the princes since 1483. Yorkist loyalists who had never accepted Henry VII's legitimacy. Former Edward IV supporters who maintained their allegiance to the rightful royal line. International allies who had opposed the Tudor seizure of power. This network had the resources, connections, and motivation to hide royal children for decades and support their adult attempts at restoration. The prince's survival wasn't just possible, it was probable, given the sophisticated support systems available to protect legitimate royal heirs. Comment below, do you think Perkin Warbeck was a pretender or the real Richard, Duke of York? Like this video if you're convinced the princes survived their supposed murders. Subscribe because next hour, we're exploring what this means for how we understand historical truth and the stories institutions tell to protect their power. We confront the weight of not knowing and what our obsession with this 540-year-old mystery reveals about human psychology, institutional power, and our responsibility to protect vulnerable children. I need to be completely honest with you. This case has fundamentally changed how I understand history, truth, and the relationship between power and vulnerability. If you followed this entire journey, hit that subscribe button and like this video. We're approaching the end of an investigation that challenges everything we think we know about how historical truth is constructed and maintained. I've spent minutes researching this case, and it's affected me psychologically in ways I didn't expect. When you spend this much time with evidence of children in mortal danger, whether they were murdered at ages 12 and 9 or spent their lives hiding from assassination, it changes your perspective on power, protection, and the stories societies tell themselves. What haunts me most is how directly this medieval case mirrors modern patterns of institutional child abuse and cover-up. I've been researching contemporary cases where children disappear in institutional care, where powerful people eliminate inconvenient young lives, where official narratives obscure uncomfortable truths about how societies fail their most vulnerable members. The mechanisms are identical. Children are isolated from protective networks. Their visibility is gradually reduced. When they disappear, official explanations are provided that serve institutional interests rather than revealing truth. Whether it's medieval princes or modern foster children, the psychology of elimination remains constant across centuries. I've interviewed multiple historians who've spent decades researching this case, and there's a psychological weight they all carry. Professor Tim Thornton, who discovered the 1522 while mentioning Edward's chain, told me he sometimes lies awake at night wondering if he's uncovered evidence of rescue or murder. The uncertainty eats at researchers who dedicate their careers to seeking truth that may be ultimately unknowable. Philippa Langley, whose Missing Princes project has uncovered survival evidence, admits the investigation has become an obsession. She feels responsible to children who may never receive justice, to truth that may never be officially acknowledged. This is what happens when you commit to seeking historical truth rather than accepting convenient narratives. The questions become personal, the uncertainty becomes burden, the responsibility becomes overwhelming. Let's return to James Tyrrell one more time, because understanding his psychology is crucial to understanding the entire case. If Tyrrell participated in harming the princes, not as their killer, but as their failed protector, what would 19 years of carrying that secret do to someone? Medieval concepts of guilt, redemption, and confession were complex. But here's what I find most telling. There's no contemporary record of Tyrrell ever expressing guilt, seeking absolution, or confessing involvement in any harm to the princes. The confession story appears only in Tudor propaganda written years after his death by people who never met him. If Tyrrell carried guilt about the princes, it might have been survivor's guilt, the psychological weight of failing to save them completely, of not being able to protect them from all harm, of watching children he cared about forced into a life of hiding and fear. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this case is how it reveals the psychology of institutional power across centuries. Westminster Abbey's refusal to allow DNA testing. Academic historians' resistance to challenging established narratives. The systematic dismissal of survival evidence. The protection of tourism revenue over historical truth. These aren't individual failures of courage or integrity. They're systemic patterns of how institutions protect their authority and credibility even at the cost of truth. The same psychology that enabled the prince's elimination in 1483, institutional self-preservation trumping protection of vulnerable individuals, continues to shape how their story is told today. As we near the end of this investigation, I want to acknowledge something that might frustrate you. We may never have definitive answers about what happened to the princes. Historical truth is often messier than we want it to be. Evidence can be incomplete, contaminated, or lost to time. Institutional resistance can prevent scientific resolution. Political narratives can obscure facts for centuries. But I've learned that the uncertainty itself teaches us something crucial about human psychology and institutional power. Our need to solve this mystery reveals our deep anxiety about how societies protect or fail to protect vulnerable children. This 540-year-old case matters today because the patterns it reveals are still active in our world. Children still disappear in institutional care systems. Powerful people still eliminate inconvenient lives. Official narratives still protect institutional credibility rather than vulnerable individuals. Every time you read about abuse in foster care, neglect in residential facilities, or cover-ups in child protection services, you're seeing the same dynamics that played out in the Tower of London in 1483. Understanding how power operated then helps us recognize how it operates now. What I've realized through this investigation is that remembering the princes, keeping their questions alive, refusing to accept convenient official narratives, is itself a form of justice. Whether they died as children in 1483 or lived to fight for their throne in the 1490s, they represent every child whose story we don't know, whose fate we can't determine, whose truth has been lost to institutional power and convenience. We can't save Edward and Richard, but we can honor them by demanding better protection for vulnerable children today. We can question official narratives that serve power rather than truth. We can refuse to accept that some lives don't matter because they're inconvenient to powerful institutions. Comment below, what has this investigation taught you about how we should treat vulnerable children in our own time? Like this video if this case has changed how you think about historical truth and institutional power. Subscribe because our final minutes will tie together everything we've discovered and explore what it means to live with historical uncertainty while maintaining moral responsibility. One more hour. We're going to confront the ultimate questions. Why do we need to solve this mystery? What does our obsession reveal about human nature? And how do we honor the memory of children whose truth may never be recovered? 540 years. 2 missing children. And we still don't know exactly what happened to them. If you followed this entire investigation, you understand something most people don't. Historical truth is messier, more uncertain, and more politically constructed than we want to believe. But you also understand why that uncertainty itself is the most important part of their story. Before we reach our final conclusions, I need you to like this video if this investigation has changed how you think about history, power, and truth. Subscribe if you believe these questions matter as much today as they did 5 centuries ago. And comment with your final theory about what happened to the princes, because your engagement with these questions is part of how we keep their memory alive. After hours of investigation, here's what I can state as historical fact. 2 royal children, Edward V aged 12 and Richard Duke of York aged 9, disappeared from the Tower of London in summer 1483. This is documented by contemporary witnesses and is not disputed by any serious historian. The traditional murder narrative comes primarily from Tudor-era accounts written 20 to 30 years later by political enemies of the accused, with clear motivations to justify Henry VII's seizure of power. The bones discovered in 1674 and claimed to be the princes have serious chain of custody problems and have never been scientifically confirmed to be Plantagenet remains despite available technology. Evidence exists suggesting the princes may have survived into adulthood, living under assumed identities and attempting to reclaim their throne through figures like Perkin Warbeck. A network of Yorkist loyalists led by families like the Tyrrells had both the motivation and capability to organize successful rescue operations for endangered royal children. But here's what we may never definitively determine: whether the princes died in 1483 or lived into the 1500s, whether Richard III ordered their deaths or their rescue, whether James Tyrrell was a killer, a protector, or uninvolved entirely, whether the Westminster Abbey bones belong to the princes or to other medieval children, and that uncertainty, frustrating as it is in our age of DNA evidence and digital certainty, is actually the most revelatory aspect of their story. Why are we so drawn to this 540-year-old case? Why have I spent hours investigating children who disappeared before Columbus reached America? Why have you spent time watching? Because the princes represent something universal and terrifying: the vulnerability of childhood in the face of adult power. They embody every child who has been failed by the systems meant to protect them. Our obsession with solving their mystery reflects our deep anxiety about our own society's ability to safeguard its most vulnerable members. We want to solve their case because we want to believe that truth wins, that justice prevails, that children matter more than institutional convenience. But what this investigation has really revealed is how power operates across time to protect itself rather than protect children. In 1483, institutional power eliminated 2 children who threatened political stability. Whether through murder or forced exile, the result was the same. Their voices were silenced, their rights were ignored, their lives were sacrificed for adult convenience. In 2024, institutional power continues to resist investigation of their fate. DNA testing is refused, survival evidence is dismissed, challenging narratives are marginalized, all to protect established authority and credibility. The mechanisms change, but the psychology remains identical. Institutional self-preservation trumps truth, adult convenience matters more than child welfare, and inconvenient questions are suppressed rather than answered. This isn't just medieval history. It's contemporary reality. Children disappear in foster care systems, and institutions resist investigations that might expose systemic failures. Official narratives are constructed to minimize institutional responsibility. Evidence that contradicts those narratives is suppressed or ignored. Residential schools, youth detention centers, religious institutions, care facilities, the patterns of institutional abuse and cover-up that we see in the prince's case continue to operate in modern contexts. Understanding how power failed the princes in 1483 helps us recognize how power continues to fail vulnerable children today. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we honor 2 children whose truth may be lost forever? We remember them not just as historical curiosities, but as representatives of every child failed by institutional power. We refuse to accept official narratives that serve authority rather than justice. We demand accountability from institutions that claim to protect children while prioritizing their own credibility. We ask uncomfortable questions about how our society treats its most vulnerable members. We challenge systems that isolate and eliminate inconvenient children. We insist that child welfare matters more than institutional reputation. Edward and Richard, wherever they are, whatever happened to them, have become symbols of questions that transcend their specific historical moment. How do we protect children from the adults meant to safeguard them? How do we distinguish between institutional narratives and historical truth? How do we maintain accountability when power structures resist transparency? How do we honor the memory of those whose stories have been silenced? These aren't medieval questions. They're eternal human questions that each generation must answer for itself. Here's what I've learned after 9 hours of investigation. The most important truth about the princes in the tower isn't what happened to them in 1483. It's what their story reveals about how societies construct truth, how institutions protect power, and how vulnerable individuals are sacrificed for adult convenience. Whether they died as children or lived to old age, whether they were murdered or rescued, whether they rest in Westminster Abbey or lie in unmarked graves, their story teaches us that some questions matter more than their answers. The prince's legacy isn't in solving their mystery. It's in understanding why we need to solve it. They represent our responsibility to protect the vulnerable, to question authority, to refuse convenient lies that serve power at the expense of truth. I started this investigation trying to solve a historical puzzle. I'm ending it with a moral challenge. What are we going to do about the vulnerable children in our own time? Every society has its princes in towers, children isolated from protection, silenced by authority, eliminated for adult convenience. Our response to their historical case reveals our commitment to contemporary child welfare. If this investigation has moved you, if it's changed how you think about power and vulnerability, then carry that understanding forward. Question institutional narratives that prioritize credibility over truth. Demand accountability from systems that claim to protect children. Support transparency over convenience. Thank you for taking this 9-hour journey with me. If this investigation has challenged your assumptions about history, truth, and institutional power, please like this video and share it with others who need to understand these patterns. Subscribe to this channel for more investigations that question official narratives and explore how historical patterns continue to shape contemporary reality. Comment below and tell me, what will you do differently because of what you've learned about how power treats vulnerable children? How will this understanding change your engagement with institutions that claim to protect rather than exploit? The princes may be gone, but the questions they raise about power, protection, and truth are eternal. In a world where official stories often hide uncomfortable truths, asking these questions isn't just academic curiosity, it's moral responsibility. Whether Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, died in the Tower of London or escaped to fight another day, their story demands that we do better for the vulnerable children in our own time. Remember their names. Question the narratives. Protect the vulnerable. The princes would want us to do nothing less. Keep investigating. Keep questioning. Keep fighting for truth and justice. Until next time.